Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Frontline Club, and thank you for coming out on this bitterly cold evening. Before I hand over to Audrey Brown, who's chairing this evening's discussion, if I can just ask you to switch your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone, because we are broadcasting live. Over to Audrey.
Hello, everybody, and good evening, and welcome to you in the panel. I know this time last week, Kenyans had finished voting. Everybody was saying, oh, well, voting over now, let's see what happens. Because in 2007, after Kenyans voted peaceably, soon all hell broke loose. And the most horrific violence that the country had ever seen, I think, in the modern democratic, post-colonial period, broke loose, leaving the nation shocked, shattered, and terrified, I think. So it was with great interest that everybody, looked forward to what was going to happen. Of course, there was much speculation about whether or not there will be violence, and that specter loomed all over. And Kenyans, rightly, I think, got very resentful of the fact that everybody was expecting violence, because in the run-up, all the things that had happened the last time seemed to be happening again, sort of politicians encouraging hate speech, which is what a lot of people felt was happening, predictions of violence and so on. But the media, quite interestingly, went on this massive campaign, peace campaign, and they compelled various politicians, or all the most influential and important politicians, to sign a pledge for peace. There were open debates, open discussions around the issues. Kenya, I think it was for the first time that they had presidential votes televised, where journalists did absolutely sterling work in, holding them to account to various things that they'd said and done in the past and what they intended doing in the future. What was also interesting is that the two parties, or the two communities that had basically perpetrated the most violence the last time around, were in an alliance this time around. So besides the fact that that illustrated, I think, the fact that in this particular instance, politics, there was no principle attached to what was happening. It also meant that, to some extent, the violence would be sort of reduced. So the questions were really serious. What was going to happen next after the Kenyan election? So we have three very able people here to discuss the questions that were asked, and to look at the conduct of the election, what happened just before, and what's possible going to happen afterwards. We thought we'd break it down into three different categories, as it were. We thought we'd look at the behavior of the people, we'd look at the behavior of the politicians, and we'd look at the conduct of the various institutions in Kenya, and also what the influence of one very big institution was on all those other categories, and that is the International Criminal Court. Because as we know, two of the main players in this election are facing charges at the ICC. To help us discuss that and unravel some of these issues, we have Matthias Muyindi, who's an editor with the BBC Monitoring Office in Nairobi, but is based here in London, and he joined Monitoring in 2002 after working with Kenyan media since graduating from Nairobi's Daystar University in 1998. He said he hates politicians and he hates politics, but he's very interested in talking about the conduct of the people, and we thought we'd start that way. Daniel Branch is an associate professor of African history at the University of Warwick, and he's also the author of Kenya Between Hope and Despair and Defeating Mau Mau, Creating Kenya, Counterinsurgency, Civil War and Decolonization. And he's going to talk about the conduct of the politicians. And Natsnet Tesfaye, who's the head of Africa Forecasting at Exclusive Analysis Limited, and she worked in the field of urban development, consulting for municipal governments in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and Latin America before she joined Africa Forecasting. And she will be talking about the institutions. So let's start from the ground up, as it were, with Matthias.
Good evening, Fiona. I think for me, the most important thing which has happened the last 1 week was to look at how Kenyans once again shocked the world. They shocked the world in the sense that a lot of people, including big media institutions, were expecting that there will be violence, there will be serious incidences which could destabilize the country and the region at large. That never came to pass. And the result which they gave the world is not the result a lot of people were expecting. I have looked at tons and tons, dozens and dozens of analyses done in the last few months, and none of them predicted a first round win for any of the candidates. People were speculating that it's going to be a runoff, possibly with the prime minister, who is now the loser, being in the front, and Kenyatta, the president-elect, will be coming a close second. That never came to pass. If you look at the margin between Odinga and Kenyatta, it's almost 1 million votes. So that was one thing which the Kenyan public shocked a lot of people. Just like 5 years ago, everybody saw an election which went on peacefully, then it exploded in massive violence. So like I was telling fellow panelists here, that the end of the Kenyan story has just begun, because we know the results are in. We know that there's a petition which is going to be filed in the next 1 or 2 weeks, but we do not expect that will be the end of the story of the Kenyan elections now.
Why?
Because if you look at the way things have turned out in that country in the last 10 years, everything tends to confound skeptics. In 2002, it was one of the biggest political stories across Africa. Political parties which for many, many years had been fractured along regional and ethnic lines, they came together and defeated a ruling party which had been in power for almost 45 years. That was a first in Africa. Then, 5 years later, the same country just fractured. Almost nobody had predicted there was going to be violence. Nobody saw what happened in 2007. That has happened now in 2012. Everybody was expecting that the ICC is going to be a stigmatizing issue on some of the people, on the candidates. It has actually turned out to be the issue which has delivered victory to Mr. Kenyatta. So now, the story of Kenya is one which continues to confound, and I keep on saying, we can make a lot of judgments, we can make a lot of predictions, but until it happens, it's when you can know what has exactly happened.
I'm just wondering whether there was a particular kind of vigilance on the part of the Kenyan people to stop politicians from behaving the way they did the last time.
Since 2007, there has been a lot of sensitization about violence, and a lot of ordinary people were really, really appalled by what happened in 2007, 2008, and nobody wanted violence. Or in the last 5 years, everybody has been speaking, let's have an election, let's have a fair contest, and let's not have, the issues which happened 5 years ago. There was that. The other aspect was that the government itself and the international community had pushed the political class in Kenya to institute all manner of legislation, institutions, which were making it very, very hard for politicians to engage in the political conduct we saw 5 years ago. Now, one of the most common words in Kenya is hate speech. Anybody has their own definition of hate speech, but everybody is always afraid of that word. Whether it's a politician, whether it's a journalist, whether it is anybody in charge, or anybody, just say, look, I don't want to engage in hate speech. Hate speech for them it just basically means inflammatory talk. So that is one thing which politicians and even ordinary people have learned, to try to take a back seat. However, that does not mean that everybody's peaceful and loves one another. No, it's just forced ethnic accommodation at the moment. And one of my biggest fears is that we didn't have violence now, but the war has just been postponed to another time. Okay, because some of the things, if you look at the way political institutions, alliances in Kenya are formed, they are so fast. They are formed by the most improbable of allies, and they collapse as fast as they happen. 2002, within 6 months, the coalition government, which defeated the former ruling party, had collapsed literally within 2003. But within 2 years, we knew the the Kibaki government, which is now leaving power, was basically had been reduced by the media, by the section of the political class. It was now being labeled as an ethnic government. Now, you look at the alliances which Prime Minister Odinga now, who has lost, formed in 2007. He had the biggest political, army this third country has ever seen. It never delivered the presidency to him, but it disintegrated within a year's time.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that brings us very neatly on to you, Daniel, and talking about politicians and their behavior before, during, and after.
And as a general point, just as an introduction, I think just to pick up on the point Matthias was making, there's a tendency to reduce many countries, not just African countries, the politics of these places to very simplistic narratives which veer between one extreme and another. And just to pick up on the point you were making about the election 5 years ago, it was actually very, very hard to find interest on the scale that's been witnessed this time from outside the country, from foreign observers, from foreign governments. Kenya was seen as being on the track to democracy. It was alongside Ghana really as Africa's great hope. It was seen as a place where one successful election where the former President Moi retired and was succeeded by Kibaki in a very peaceful election, and one peaceful referendum where the government was defeated. This was seen as sufficient grounds really to consider Kenya as being sort of, if not democratised, then certainly well on the way there. And I think there's somewhat strange, certainly to me, narrative emerging from this election that it was a good election, whereby the fact there's been peace is seen as evidence in itself of things in Kenya being back on track, really. Now, I mean, I'm torn here because I don't have quite the same personal connections Matthias does to Kenya, but it's certainly a place I know well. On one hand, I breathed a huge sigh of relief in this past week that things didn't go badly. On the other hand, I'm worried that simply because things didn't go badly, that there's going to be an excessive haste to declare the election a good process, to ignore the very substantial problems with institutions, particularly the IEBC, the Electoral and Boundary Commission, and put that to one side. The other thing I think that's going to go on what I should be talking about
Thank you.
is a willingness to see a sea change in political culture, particularly at the very top of government, that somehow people have seen the error of their ways in the past and have embraced a sort of more peaceful method of politics. And I think, to be blunt, and this isn't a criticism of any one candidate or any one coalition, but across the board, there wasn't the strategic reasons for violence this time round. And I think we need to understand violence of the sort we saw in 2007, 2008 as a top-down and a bottom-up process. And I take everything, I don't quibble at all with what was just said there about, from the bottom, a sort of view up, an unwillingness to engage in violence. But I think that from the top down, there wasn't the same strategic element. For one thing, the Kalenjin and Kikuyu split, which has been the sort of divisive issue within Kenyan politics, certainly since the early 1990s and probably much longer before that, where the Kikuyu, now President-elect Kenyatta, and the Kalenjin deputy Ruto came together in an alliance. And this didn't just minimise the incentive for violence between Kalenjin and Kikuyu, but it minimised the strategic value of violence, full stop. Because in the past, what's happened is violence has been triggered in very, very localised conflicts in the coast, in northern Kenya, on the border with Uganda, on Mount Elgon, and in the Rift Valley itself. And politicians have found this very, very hard to control. And this has generally created a sense of conflicts around the country, of insecurity, and then other sort of fires break out, often very literally.
Tana River.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And the problem this time was, of course, the fire that always breaks out is that between the Kalenjin and the Kikuyu. So if there had been more Tana River, the violence in the coastal region...
I think maybe we should decode Tana River.
Well, there's sort of clashes in an area right up near, close, not far from the sort of... yeah, exactly. So we're sort of talking eastern, northeastern Kenya here. Conflicts between local communities with a political edge, with politicians patronising militias with a view to the election upcoming. If that sort of violence had taken place in more places around Kenya, it would eventually have led at some point to the Rift Valley.
And there was a fear that, because Tana River, in fact, from October was it last year, there were instances, massive instances of violence going on in that part of the country.
But these conflicts had to be kept to a minimum if this Kalenjin Kikuyu alliance was going to hold. Now, equally on the other side, the Accord coalition led by Raila Odinga, the former Prime Minister and defeated candidate, set itself up as the party of reform. It set itself up as the party that supported judicial reform particularly. It could not call its supporters out onto the streets to protest this time. It would have been accused of hypocrisy. It would have been accused of undermining the very, very same processes that it had championed. So really, on both sides of the sort of division, there is no incentive for violence this time. But I emphasise the point, there is no reason to think that these politicians have changed their spots on all sides here. Now, the ICC factor is very interesting in this and may have had an effect, but this now may be counteracted by events today, but we'll move on, I think.
Well, events today being that one of the people who was supposed to face charges at the ICC, Francis Mudaura, right?
Yeah.
He's,
Former cabinet secretary.
yeah, charges against him have been dropped at the ICC. So that brings us on to talking about institutions, in fact, and the ICC being one of the big ones. And that's Tesnet.
I'll focus mainly on some key, ostensibly impartial, nonpartisan institutions, and ICC being an external actor, so focusing first with the domestic actors. We've already brought up the Electoral Commission, Electoral and Boundary Commission, and it was a body that was reformed under the new constitution. It was meant to go through a digitization process in order to install some level of credibility around the vote results. We saw over the course of last week that all of these electronic safeguards that were meant to be put into place, largely funded by this government in the UK, started to break down. And so they reverted back to the manual counting. Now, these glitches, literally, call into question the integrity of the results, and also the integrity of the institution and its role as a nonpartisan actor. And so it's based on this that we're seeing that Odinga is trying to file a petition questioning the announced results that came out this morning. Now, when looking at the actual election process, it was incredibly interesting because you've seen reports and there was this, fear of violence both internally and amongst the region and concerned external actors. And one of the key factors was the reform of the security forces and the deployment to hotspot areas. Now, from what we've seen, there was, to a large degree, mitigation of outbreaks of violence. While we have some reports from people locally that there were underreported events of violence, for the most part, it seems as if the security forces were there but keeping a low profile so as not to be an agitator. Now, one can question whether or not they were not acting in order to stop things or not acting in order to not to instigate. But that leads us on to, I think, a third and important institution which will truly become tested over the coming weeks, and that is the judiciary, and specifically the Supreme Court. So under this new constitution now, we've also had judicial reform and also policies whereby you can file a petition within 7 days of the announced results. And it's something that I think the panel has unanimously agreed that is likely to be done by Odinga, possibly other candidates. Now, this is likely to be a true test in which way the government and the reforms are going, as we're going to see whether or not the judiciary has actually matured and reformed in order to make this decision. On the one hand, it could rule with the national interest at stake, and that is to confirm the results. Or on the other, it could look at the technical evidence that is likely to be brought forward and decide whether or not Kenya is actually going to have to set itself up for a runoff vote, a rerun vote.
Why do you think it's in the national interest that they confirm the vote, the decision now?
In order to offset any possible violence around the second vote, where people are likely to be more vigilant about what's going on and looking for any instances of rigging or fraud. If they call the vote into question, and then in a sense that would probably be an admission of some type of fraud around the manual counting, and that will heighten suspicions against the president-elect and the victor in the elections. But looking how external actors are supporting the democratic process in Kenya, we've seen, interestingly enough, the AU has come out and supported or congratulated Kenyatta. We've seen regional governments have also done the same. And if we put that against what other external actors, you hear that Obama made a statement that Kenya is one of the most dangerous places for a journalist nowadays. And it's something that's interesting in making that that statement because you would expect there would be some type of congratulation for a peaceful process, but highlighting likely dissatisfaction amongst Western donors at how the process was held and who the victor is, considering his ICC indictment. And we're looking at the ICC, I mean, Africans themselves most often think that it's a political body that will make a political decision rather than an impartial one. There's generally a sentiment that Kenyatta, especially with the dismissal of the case this morning, will be able to beat this. And that external pressure will be put on the court, the international court, in order to somehow make this case go away. And it's really truly accepting that the court will make a decision on its own is something that will need to be seen on the ground in Kenya. I realize we discussed it downstairs, that there's widely popular support around it, but I think the ICC plays the role as the biggest aggravator in the situation going forward. Whether or not the results are confirmed, what's going to happen to the future of Kenyatta?
But there also is a feeling that people voted for Kenyatta because of the ICC, as a kind of an act of defiance almost.
Especially when the news of the delay of his trial is seen as a mini victory. And that happened just days before the vote. And so one could speculate that that could have led to an upswing of support to Kenyatta and Ruto.
There were other institutions as well. I mean, the media and social media, especially. Talk to us a little bit about, and any of the other panelists, if you want to as well, from the point of view of politicians, because there were some who felt that because they had big Twitter followings, that they were going to win the vote. And, well, just the fact that a lot of the vigilance that we were talking about earlier on the part of citizens was actually enacted on Twitter, especially. So start with the role that the media played and social media.
Looking at the media, Kenya has quite a vibrant media community, and looking at the role that they played, you get the sense that there was this active self-censorship in trying to ensure that things cannot be interpreted as a possible trigger for another round of violence, something that could possibly ignite one community and spread very quickly, as we saw in the last election. So you see this active participation of the media in the election process, and it's quite interesting as they saw themselves as keeping the peace in the way of fostering a petition amongst the candidates or in selectively reporting certain things and heavily editing any coverage, whether it was campaigns, rallies, and even the speeches that we saw from Odinga on Saturday and Ruto. And so the media one could argue that the media played a role in keep diffusing the situation when there were high points of tension and friction amongst communities on a local level.
But I think it was an overreaction to a very simplistic reading of what happened last time, which is that somehow the way in which the results were prolonged in a very similar way in 2007, and the way the media reported those results had somehow triggered the violence, whereas anyone that knew anything about Kenyan politics will tell you that violence was for much more deep-seated reasons than the presentation of the results. And there was also another narrative that emerged last time, which was about the use of text messages to spread hate speech. And I think there's actually a really important discussion needs to be had here about the role of the media in Kenyan society. Is its role to act as a sort of unifying force, or is it its role to actually be a forum for debate? And I think one thing now that's coming up in the last, I'm seeing this from the same distance as everyone else in this room, is it's very difficult to discuss the technicalities of the vote because that's now seen as being divisive, whereas now the country should be moving on. The second point is on the issue, what was actually the substance of the debate. As you were discussing earlier, what was Odinga's message? Land reform. But of course, land issues were actually declared as an example of hate speech at one point in the campaign. And because it inevitably leads to discussions about Kikuyu ownership of land in the Rift Valley and other communities as well, but that most importantly. And there's this sort of language of the sort of cohesion of unity, of nationalism and so on, is actually, I think, in danger of silencing one of Kenyan society's greatest assets, which is a very open, frank discussion of politics. And I think there's a danger of going too far in the opposite direction. I have no doubt that there was, inflammatory statements made. I mean, we all know that Sang is one of the guys that's about to stand trial precisely for his alleged role in that. But in 2007, but there is, I think, a danger of going too far and losing one of Kenyan society's greatest assets.
I mean, if you look at the mainstream Kenyan media, everybody declares they are they're impartial, they're independent, they don't have a political agenda. But if you look at output, especially at key political moments, you can start detecting the subtle messages which are being passed. And the key thing is, mainstream Kenyan media during this election, especially when it came to now the tallying of the votes, they took a back seat. When Odinga's people, now the losing candidates, held a press conference at a Nairobi hotel and say, look, something is not right here. Normally, you would have expected somebody to carry that press conference at least live or to give it some mention, say, wait, we hear that XYZ is complaining about that. That was not mentioned for many, many hours. It was picked by what we call the fringe media. They picked it, they translated the story, and they put it online. And then the wire agencies picked it up, and now it became an international story. So 2 hours later is when now the mainstream TV, which had been at that press conference, they had the recordings, when they start now playing those clips of what Odinga is doing. I mean, what he's complaining about. If you look at the output from what we call the vernacular radio stations, those are some of the most powerful media outlets in the country. Radios which broadcast in local vernacular languages. For all along, messages, the key message for them was that we know what happened the last time. One of us is on trial at the ICC. You better know what you are doing, because for a long time, journalists in Kenya, you didn't have to have any formal training. Do you know, can you speak some basic English? Can you entertain people on air? Yeah, you go, there's a job for you. So now, the laws have changed. Now, everybody has to have had some formal training of some kind. So
I don't know if that's going to help.
I mean, no, in theory, that is what it's supposed to be. But if you look at the conduct, the political of the media now, they seem to have said, oh, we didn't have violence like the last time. Things have gone on well. And they are not interrogating the process like, some of the issues which are being discussed. I've seen Kenyan newspapers. Nobody's talking about what exactly happened with this electronic system, which actually was not purchased by the Kenyan government. It was a loan given by the Canadian government. So we are going to pay for a loan for a system which never worked.
Okay.
That's number one. So nobody's actually saying, I think it's about $300 million, if I'm not, I don't know how much money it is. But it's a huge sum of money because it was given by Canada. The equipment was purchased in France, and it came. And I remember Kofi Annan said, look, this is a very sophisticated system. You better test it in time. It was.
In fact, didn't the testing system had to be postponed twice or three times?
They kept on postponing because the Kofi Annan kept on making, he said, look, this system, you say you are going to register voters biometric, you are going to do what, electronic tallying of votes. You have never done it before. We have never seen it anywhere in Africa. Please try it in advance.
We do.
I mean, some parts of that, South Africa. And everybody in the Electoral Commission, you always had an excuse why to, and when they did test them, it was just, I think, a very small sample of people, and most of them were in the urban centers. So it gave you, it didn't give you the right thing. The other aspect I want to mention is about the social media. Social media in 2007 was a very instrumental outlet in trying to explain to the world what exactly was happening. One of the biggest crowdsourcing facilities was born in Kenya around that time. It was called Ushahidi. It was basically you send a text message and say, violence is happening where I am. This is what is happening, X, Y, Z. And they'll just map that. So over the years, it has been, people build on that success story. But if you look at traffic of, in social media in Kenya, the political conduct of people who comment on anything on that country has never changed in the last 5-10 years. Even up to today, you see the exchanges which I was wondering about this decision by the Prime Minister to go and appeal against the case. So much nasty comment, traffic going on online. And it is strange because the institution, in theory, the government says we have up to about half a dozen bodies policing the media, looking for hate speech. Nobody has ever been arrested, ever. Okay. They arrest politicians, but not anybody who writes anything.
Okay. Thank you very much to all three of you for allowing us that look into Kenyan politics from your point of view. Now, anybody, questions? I think we might cluster the questions. Okay, so let's start with lady in red at the back.
It's been said that the new government is the Moi Youth Club. They're the generation that grew up under that government. What can we expect from them? Who have we got in power? Who have Kenyans voted in?
I can give an answer, and I know David will have some comments on that.
Isn't that your former boss?
Yes. I mean, if you look at the people, the president-elect, he was the person, the former president, not the one who's in power, the one who left power in 2002. He said, "This is the man I want you to, to vote as my successor." Kenyatta by then was a very young man. I think he was 38. He was so shy, he could not even say anything. And I used to feel sorry for him because Moi will trot him all in these public places and say, "This is the Moi I want this man I want to succeed." And he'll just stand up and wave with the crowd, and that's it. He has learned his lesson, and you can see 10 years what he has done. His deputy now, Ruto, is the one who has a more interesting political history. He left the university in 1990. In 1992, when Moi was really under pressure to liberalize politics and reform state institutions, he could not do that. He realized he could lose power. So he employed two tactics: unleashed massive ethnic violence in the countryside, and then they just decided to print money. Ruto was in charge of the group which was now distributing the money. And the speculation has always been that that's where his enormous wealth came from. So the first time people say Ruto earned a salary was when he went to parliament. So he has always got into money a long time ago. And he has always said that money. So him and Kenyatta, they have always been associated with a political party which was really, really discredited and hated. The problem with Kenyatta has never personally been accused of anything in terms of corruption, in terms of anything. But people judge him by the company he keeps. Then there's the political conduct of his dad when he was in power in the 1960s. The land problems we have in Kenya, it tends to be blamed on his father. So,
And they're also one of the biggest landowners in the country.
yeah, the people say half of Kenya belongs to the Kenyattas. And especially the most fertile regions in the Rift Valley and the most, the prime beach plots. And that's why you could see in the coastal region, Kenyatta got less than 10% of the vote. People say, look, we are having land problems here. You are the biggest landowner for the last 50 years. If you had anything you are going to do for us, you should have done it. So we have no business with you.
So do you think that he will do something about it?
The coastal region in Kenya, land is a very sensitive issue because if he starts doing something, it's just going to go to some of the core issues which maybe he believes in, because people say, one, your family is one of the biggest shareholders in this country, the landowners in this country. Are you going to, because there are some questions about how they acquired some of the land parcels. Are you going to account for that? Now, if he doesn't account for that, that's one issue. The other aspect that, are you going to carry out a proper land reform system? Okay. If you carry out land reform in places like the coastal region, you are basically, Kenyatta has to give up most of that land because they acquired it, in very dubious circumstances. Okay. That's number one. In the Rift Valley, where violence has always happened in the last 30, 40 years, land is at the bottom. That's it. So if he starts, reforming that land, it's basically, provoking some of the people who put him in office.
I think there's another issue concerning what the youth club is going to do. It's a security, isn't it? Somalia, just there.
Well,
I'll just address the Somalia point. Yes,
Okay.
quickly. I think the interesting thing is the policy outlook. Kenyatta's been in government for how many years now, how many decades you could say. And so what is the policy outlook? Is it likely to change? And under Kenyatta presidency, if he's confirmed, you're unlikely to see any changes in that regard. In fact, the business community is probably giving a sigh of relief right now, considering that he's cut from the same cloth, and he's likely to pursue the same fiscal monetary policy he did as finance minister. But a key thing is external engagement. How are external actors and key donors going to engage with someone who's indicted by the ICC? And for the most part, you've seen a lot of lip service and rhetoric about, sentiments against someone indicted by the ICC being voted into power and causing some key donors to reconsider their relationship with Kenya. But when you look at the role that Kenya plays, militarily and being a nodal point for security in Somalia and against al-Shabaab, and setting up the Somali state in its nascent stages, in South Sudan and being a logistic hub into feeding the new country and its growing economy, in terms of being a regional actor within IGAD as well as in the EAC. Not to talk about, as a base of humanitarian operations, as a key financial hub for the East Africa region. Many people, external actors, regional counterparts, are heavily invested in Kenya, so can they really afford to change the terms of their engagement?
And especially since I think what's also important is that Uhuru Kenyatta has said in the code that we will fulfill our international obligations. So he's not al-Bashir, he's not a fugitive in that sense. So
Well, in a sense, but then he also has the benefit of attracting, or varying his trade partners. So he's not as concerned about money coming from Europe or the U.S. as much as he is about new money coming in from India, China, other South-South partners, as well as other regional African countries that are investing in Kenya.
I think just on that point, just to jump in, Kenya's had a disengaged president for 8 years,
For a decade.
and
one Mwai Kibaki.
and he's had quite difficult relations with the British government at times, and it's perfectly possible to do business with the Kenyan government.
Without-
Kenya isn't the president.
Yeah.
The government isn't the president. I think
Okay.
that's important.
But the other
So
aspect is, okay. I just wanted to add
I
on the
suppose
economy.
it's worth dwelling on this since it's quite... Okay, let's go.
The economy, what I wanted to add was that Kenyatta, there's no way he can try to disengage himself from the West. The key economic sectors in Kenya, they tend to depend on the West. The horticulture, the tourism, everything is all just geared to the West. Chinese have come, they have built roads in Kenya, but I can't count how many Chinese tourists we get. But you can bet most of the key Western, most of Kenya's trade is mainly with the West. So Kenyatta has to balance, how do I continue maintaining this healthy economic setup at the same time? Just how do I deal with this, pressure from the West?
Covering by Skype, apparently.
Yeah,
That's what it's been called.
he claims he's going to run the country by Skype if he goes to the ICC. How true that, but how it can work, we do not know. But the aspect, he has to balance of the West, that's the key economic partners we have, but they are the same people who are giving me pressure.
But
So somebody
let's take
said,
into
one
consideration-
second, someone once said, the first time, if Kenyatta is confirmed to be president, his first people will be calling the White House and he'll call Downing Street and say, look, I got a problem with the ICC, but you guys, what can you do? Yeah, that's what that's the rumor in Nairobi.
Okay. I think let's let our audience in.
Thanks. My name's Sandra. I'm a communications advisor. Just about ICC, obviously it's been boiled down to a question of sovereignty a lot, which is a shame, rather than a question of justice. And 1,000 people died about 5 years ago. I'm just wondering whether people feel justice has been done in that situation, or whether these men who are indicted still have a case to answer, because the issue of justice seems to have fallen by the wayside.
You're just that or that.
But it fell by the wayside on 2 previous occasions as well in the 1990s. I think it's just, no one, as far as I'm aware, has been prosecuted at any level for violence after the last election. We're talking now, local courts,
locally.
national courts.
No
one.
In terms of justice, especially after the last violence, the Kenyan national courts have never convicted anybody for any of those crimes.
In fact, that's why we now have the
Yeah.
ICC indictment, isn't it?
That's why you brought in the ICC indictment,
Yeah.
because people had lost so much faith in the local judicial institution. Say, look, let's have an external actor. Forget about these things of sovereignty. Forget about these things of neocolonialism. We just want somebody who will just, ensure justice. Now, that was the narrative for a long time until the Kenyatta and his people appeared at the ICC. If you look at the original footage, it was very comical. They went and sang, national, patriotic songs there. They came back and now they say, look, the best way we are going to survive this is that we are going to whip up our ethnic groups. So support for the ICC is high across board in most parts of Kenya. But if you go to the region, in the Rift Valley, where Kenyatta's deputy president-elect comes from, it's almost non-existent. If you go to Central Province, They don't believe in the ICC. So now you have the president and vice president, and deputy president, whose community don't support the ICC. And that's the biggest problem Kenyatta is going to have. Kenyatta is not going to have a problem because the ICC has a warrant on him. It's just satisfying the constituency again around him. He has told them all along, the ICC is a Western plot to buy me from the presidents. And the stooge the West is using is the prime minister.
It didn't help, I don't think, that,
That was
about a month before the elections, various people, including Kofi Annan, Johnny Carson, the British High Commissioner, Barack Obama, were basically threatening Kenyans and saying, you have to think carefully who you vote for because...
consequences.
I think that was quite important.
I think you're absolutely right. I think there was a moment of collective stupidity, and I think I actually think it was incredibly patronising. The basic sentiment behind it was that the Kenyans were somehow ignorant of the debate and ignorant of the consequences. And anyone that had stepped foot in Kenya at any stage in the past 5 years could tell you that that was not the case, and that everyone knew exactly what the situations were. Okay. Even the most pro-ICC individual would be aware of the problems of sovereignty. They would be conscious of what this said about Kenya. Even the most anti-ICC person would be aware that voting for someone who's indicted by the ICC would have ramifications for Kenya's diplomatic relations going forward.
And there was the overall feeling that impunity must end. That somebody's got to pay for 1,400 people dead and thousands of people still displaced.
Exactly, and most of them are Odinga, from Kenyatta's ethnic group.
Okay. So.
Thank you. I wonder if you could say a bit
Please
more.
tell us your name.
My name's Carrie, and I'm involved in all sorts of education work here, and I'm interested in if any of you could talk a bit more about the preventative work that was done in Kenya with young people to prevent violence. So the scale of it, where it happened, anything, because it seems so important and so applicable to other places.
Who wants to take that?
I think you want to take on that. Well, one of the things is that in the old days, most of the political parties used to have youth wings. And Kenyatta, despite all the things people have said about him, there's one thing he was very sharp about.
Uhuru
Kenyatta.
Okay.
His campaign was, the average age of the people who were running his campaign, I understand, was 27, 28, 30. So he just kind of created this aspect, look, this is our time to change Kenya. And the last time you young people, you got involved in violence, which has got us into big trouble. So he was very sharp in that, whereby he tapped in at frustrations of the Kenyan youth, especially in the urban areas, whereby now he tried to portray them, they are people who can actively shape the destiny of this country. Most of the other parties, especially the one which of his point opponent, they also incorporated the youth in most of the decision-making processes. Like Odinga's campaign had something called the ODM Reloaded. That was just like all the youthful people who want to stand on his platform. They would go campaign for him. They also campaign for themselves. So you will never see anybody who is above 40 in that group. And they were always, doing carnivals everywhere, all over the country. So you start get a feeling of that. Most of the young people had been brought into the mainstream of the politics. And that was something, in one way, it diffused the pressures. At the same time, these warnings about people are going to pay if you participate in violence. ICC, the indictment of Kenyatta and the other four people was real. And people realized, so the last time we burned people's houses, we killed people, somebody's actually going to appear before a judge. Who is going to be the next one? There was that, so, carrot and stick, you bring them into the mainstream, but also they knew, if I participate in violence, you never know which categories they are going to charge this time. They might say, look, we are not looking for the top guns, now we are looking for the foot soldiers. Okay.
And there was also quite a strong, collectively the media houses in Kenya broadcast, these messages of peace. And I think that went quite a way as well to sensitizing people to, what could, and also I think people's memories just of what happened last time.
Can I also be a cynic? I don't disagree, but there weren't the same patrons walking around with the cash.
No.
I think not to
Yeah.
I mean, people. I don't want to make this sound too flippant, but violence wasn't irrational. It wasn't senseless last time.
It
Okay,
was systematic.
It was
Yeah.
rational. It was targeted. It was contracted out, and that same dynamic wasn't present. So I think that's something else.
Okay. There's sorry, the lady here, and then you ask. You.
Thanks very much. My name's Olivia Toy from the Gatsby Charitable Foundation. We're a foundation that has various agricultural sector projects in East Africa, including Kenya.
Can everybody hear? A little
Sorry.
bit louder.
I'll say that again. My name's Olivia Toy from the Gatsby Charitable Foundation. We're a foundation that invests in East Africa in agricultural sectors. So my question was, people have said this election is one of the most complicated that Kenya has ever had. They always say that. But for many reasons, not only the ICC, but also the new constitution that's being implemented. And I wanted to ask what the panel's opinion is on whether, on how that will go, that process, and particularly the new or president-elect's ability to put that into place, not only the decentralization, but also the new judiciary.
You can. This actually comes back to the first question about who have Kenyans elected, because they haven't just elected a president, they've also elected county legislatures, they've elected governors, they've elected senators to oversee the interests of counties in central government as well as MPs and the president, obviously, and women's representatives as well. So there were sort of 6 elections, which is why exactly the point you're making about this is very complicated. And I think there's a crucial point here, looking ahead to what's next, is what they've elected as actually a divided central government, a coalition whose interests are dominated by the ICC, but who don't agree on the most fundamental issue that confronts Kenya, which is devolution. You in fact have the 2 polar opposites within Kenyan politics represented in this coalition, with Ruto's party and his community being probably historically the most agitated for devolution, and Kenyatta's Kikuyu community and his party being the most opposed to devolution taking place. And that tension is really going to play out. The other thing that Kenyans elected is around areas which are going to become much more important for strategic reasons to do with Somalia and other border regions, to do with development projects going through Lamu in the northeast with the border with Somalia, around that sort of arc from the Uganda border at Mount Elgon all the way around the border. They've actually tended to elect governors from ODM and other parties who are pro-devolution. So it's very easy to see coming up a real argument about distribution of resources, oil and gas finds, these major development projects. Who is going to reap the rewards? Is central government going to control the revenues? Are local administrations going to get involved as well? And I think that really gets to the heart of what the politics of the country is going to be like for the next 5 years if you take the ICC out of the picture.
Absolutely.
I think a key point is the natural resource potential. It's not just oil and gas, onshore and offshore, but it's also mining that's already starting. And so that's another complicating factor. We talked about how the industries that are active are rooted with Western interests, but these are very capital-intensive, cash-rich industries that could potentially shift Kenya's focus in terms of trading partners and how independent they are of existing trading partners.
And almost all of these resources are found in locations where there's strong support for devolution and for local authority. And you now have a president who comes from a political tradition that opposes that.
And if I might clarify something, when you talk about devolution, sometimes in the village it's a totally different concept. It's a question of, here is our region, anybody else, even if you have been deployed there by the central authority, by the central government, people just think, oh, you have just come visiting. And a lot of these counties, most of Kenya has 47 counties, almost 99%, they were drawn along ethnic lines. So if you find, like, for example, the southeast where I come from, they have discovered coal, and I understand the Chinese are there. It's almost, I think, 40 billion, tons of coal. And suddenly you look at the narrative which is going across the local media, it is just frightening. So the struggle...
What are they saying?
The narrative is this is our coal. Okay, the central government has to come and negotiate with the local authorities here. Maybe they're arguing that we keep 80%, central government takes 20%. If you got the coastal region, which literally obliterated Kenyatta, the coastal region, they argue the port region belongs to them. So for them, anything to be imported in Kenya has to pay, all the duties have to remain at the coastal region. That's how it's being, devolution, people understand it.
Okay.
So now, when you start going to explain to them, no, that's not what devolution, that's where, what David is talking about, that's where the split between the president and the deputy will just erupt.
Okay. Lady here. Yeah.
My name's Joanna, I'm from Control Risks. I just wanted to dig a bit deeper on that question of devolution and what you think that will actually tangibly mean. Do you think Kenyatta will drag his feet in terms of dismantling the provincial government that's currently in place? Do you think we'll see more localised clashes like we've seen in Tana River? Do you think we'll see it becoming more complicated for businesses in terms of multiple stakeholders? How do you actually think we'll see the sort of tangible results of devolution and this tension that you talked about?
Well, I think the point about business, I think, is a good one. You will have to, businesses and investors will have to negotiate with governors, with county legislatures, as well as national government. I think it's too early to speculate about policy directions. I think the most likely outcome is a sort of a considerable overlap between central and local government, and a sort of battle for power. It's too politically risky for Kenyatta to reverse a great deal of devolution, because I think the support for devolution is almost total outside of the Mount Kenya region.
Absolutely.
I think it would just be political suicide to go back on that, whatever his instincts might be. But there are key interests in Nairobi that will want to protect what they hold. I think it's going to play out differently in different locations. The role of governor, county governor, and particularly in cities, I think, looking at the political landscape, one of the big things that's changed is Nairobi now has a governor. Mombasa now has a governor. In a way, and it makes the city a much more important political entity. Now, whether they are launch pads for politicians to emerge, are we going to see ambitious individuals who want to assert themselves on that stage, or are they going to be clients of national politicians? It's going to play out differently in different areas, but I do think this really does complicate the picture about what's going forward. It's just I couldn't give a sort of accurate prediction of the picture.
What you said about provincial administration, I think when the new constitution came and said they were given 5 years to phase it out, so we are already in year 3, and now with governors coming to take office in the next few months, people will say, look, we have elected the people to run this county. The only thing the central government can do is just to deploy technical staff, not the district commissioner, not a provincial governor. Those ones will be technically be phased out. And there's acceptance even among hardline central people who really can't stand devolution. There's a realization that whichever way it goes, the devolved system is here to stay now.
But I would question whether or not, as much as the Constitution has said it, we've seen on multiple instances whether or not the spirit of the Constitution is actually recognized, and there has been some delay in dragging of feet in full implementation of key legislation. So with regard to the dissolving of provincial administrations, whether or not they will actually be dissolved because they provide a parallel system with direct line and authority to the president, therefore he can curb and check the authority of this new tier of government that poses a threat to his centralized grasp on power.
And the administration police being a crucial aspect to this, a sort of parallel police force.
So in speaking to the scenario where you're talking about of this parallel system where it's issues of double taxation or things of that nature, what role this provincial administration will play in maintaining the president's control down to the local level, despite this newly introduced level of government?
Lady in the back there. I never thought I would ever say this at a public meeting, but it seems like, where are the men? Don't you have any questions? Every single question's been a woman so far. Not that I'm complaining.
Hi, I'm Priya Chada. I run for Integrity Peace Campaign in Kenya in the build-up to the elections. And to address a question earlier about what the youth were doing or how they were addressed, and it was primarily a youth-targeted non-partisan rally held in Nakuru and in Mombasa. The attendance at each one was an average of over 6,000 people of the youth. And we use music and local artists to sort of communicate the concept of integrity and leadership in order to get peace. And that was what we were talking about, was the peace equation. we found that the foreign media and a lot of the local media bypassed this sort of story because it wasn't sensational enough and it wasn't sort of showing the possible violence that could happen, because it was actually a very positive story about the fact that a lot of youth had come out when there were multiple political rallies going on and actually attended a peace campaign to talk and discuss about how they can be a stand for integrity and leadership and how they want a new change. So I was just wondering, in the upcoming, now that Uhuru Kenyatta has been sort of almost, we're sure that he's going to be appointed, what will the foreign media role be? Because, I mean, his campaign was run primarily on an anti-West platform, and that was going to be, I think, his intent to scuttle the results if he hadn't won. How involved are the West going to be in terms of covering his new reign of power accurately?
I think the first few days, the first few hours of the election, the jokes which were going on Twitter in Kenya was foreign journalists were just stranded in the hotels because they had no story to cover. They'd come for violence, they were not getting it, and there was, a lot of them were not really, that's according to Kenyan people on Twitter, they were very disappointed. Now, big papers like The Economist, which do a lot of political reporting and business reporting, definitely they'll continue to cover. The BBC has a massive presence in Kenya. The Chinese have made Nairobi the hub for their African activity. I mean, media operations. Everybody is in Nairobi to do Africa. I mean, everybody.
Al Jazeera,
all their big African headquarters are in Nairobi. So the continued presence of big foreign media will continue being in Nairobi. Whether they are going to be interested in the Kenyan story as they were in the run-up to the election is another story. But there are always key things which are going to happen in Kenya in the next few months, which will always excite them. We have the petition against Kenyatta. We have the ICC trials coming up in the next few months. And then after that, we have a devolved system now.
And we always have Somalia.
And then there's Somalia next door, and there's, huge things happening in the region, which is going to, interest them. But in terms of, just being obsessed with Kenya elections as such, I think they'll just report it on a case-by-case basis and they'll scale it down. But you'll have, those who have a full-time presence there. The news agencies are there full-time. They'll always have a Kenyan story almost every other day. BBC will always have something. Al Jazeera is there and CCTV. The good thing is that the Chinese never said anything towards the election. They have never said anything up to today.
Gentlemen there.
Hi, my name's Simon Waddington, and for the last 6 months I've been an election consultant in Kenya. Can I correct a few things about the voting system, which I think might lead to a bit of confusion? The voting was never electronic. It was always manual voting.
Yes.
It was the transmission of the votes which was always electronic, which is why part of Odinga's petition to the High Court is also against Safaricom, against Bob Collymore.
Yes.
My question is, when or if the case against Uhuru collapses at the ICC, how do you think this will be played out in the international media?
It depends on the ground. I think it'd be improper to speculate on the grounds that a case might be dismissed, and I think that will determine how it's received. If it's seen as diplomatic, a sort of realpolitik sort of approach, then I think it'll be sceptically received. If there's actually well-founded reasons for its dismissal, then I think that will get a very different coverage. The crucial point, I think, that we can talk about reasonably is if Uhuru's case is dismissed and Ruto stands, that has very severe political implications, I think, for the coalition.
Exactly. That's what I wanted to say. Kenyatta's case might collapse in July when it starts. But before then, Ruto's trial will have already commenced in May. And if you look at what some of the ICC people who have been charged at the ICC are saying about one another, they say, Kenyatta's people are the ones who supplied evidence against Ruto. Ruto's people are the same ones who supplied against Kenyatta. So now, if you have a case whereby the president, he has no case to answer, Today is the former head of civil service. He has no case to answer. So you basically have a trial against Ruto, the deputy president, and that is now it's going to become very tribal now. I said, look, this guy told us we get into an alliance with the president. The president has been let off by the ICC. We are the only ones on trial, and the prosecution witnesses, most of them will come from Kenyatta's side. So that's when it starts going to become messy. Like I told you, political alliances in Kenya, they tend to collapse so fast. So before June, July, you might just be a very complicated state, state or in the top echelons of the Kenyan political system.
Lady over there, right at the back.
Hi, my name is Kui. I work for KPMG in London, but I'm Kenyan, obviously. And my question was related to, for the first time, at least since multipartism that I can remember, there weren't any clashes in Molo. And is that because of the Kalenjin Kikuyu alliance? And is that the future? Is that the most post-tribal Kenya is ever going to get? It's just going to be whoever's in alliance at the time. And that was it. Will we be having this conversation in another next elections about whoever is not in power fighting each other? Because we had the fighting at the coast. We had clashes at the coast. So will we just move on to the next person who's not in the alliance?
Well, as Matthias has been saying, alliances collapse as quickly as they formed.
I think if you look at the Rift Valley region there, and that where the area she's talking about, Molo, is somewhere there. You can see it. It has a history of very, very nasty ethnic violence, and it has always happened in 1992, 1997. There was not so much in 2002. 2007, massive ethnic violence there. And it is right now the ethnic groups which inhabit the Rift Valley, they're in a political alliance. And if anything goes wrong between those two, I can guarantee you it's going to explode immediately. People won't even have to wait for any. It's just going to explode.
No text messages.
No text messages. Like, for example, if Kenyatta's case collapses, the Ruto is effectively being under trial because the ICC seems to believe it has a solid case against him. And it becomes evident that the witnesses against Ruto come from the Kikuyu ethnic group of Kenyatta. It's going to play very badly in that region. Okay. So the next election, you won't even be talking about a Jubilee alliance of Kenyatta and Ruto. You'll possibly, Odinga will have reinvented himself and come back again.
But he'll be too old, according to
well, the man, the nickname by his supporters, they call him what? Act of God. Every time he's down, he survives. And he doesn't care about age anyway.
Okay. Yeah. Is there anybody in the back that wants to ask a question?
My name's Jo. I'm from the Africa Governance Initiative. It's kind of picking up on that question that was just asked, so it's maybe been partly asked already. But thinking about the ethnic character of Kenyan politics, and I think after the shock of the violence in the last election and the elections in the 90s as well, there was sort of a hope among a lot of Kenyan observers that that shock would lead not just to a rejection among the Kenyan population of violence around elections, but also a rejection of that ethnic character behind politics. And, all the stuff we've been discussing today suggests that hasn't really happened. But I just wondered if any of their panellists had seen any signs in the election that there might be, in the future, a move towards a more kind of programmatic character to politics in Kenya, any kind of green shoots, maybe among the youth or in the cities, that in the future we might be able to move away from this kind of way of doing things.
You've written a lot on it.
This gets to one of the things I often get a little bit frustrated with, that ethnicity isn't necessarily bad and it doesn't necessarily trigger violence. There are many African countries which are just as ethnically divided as Kenya which don't witness violence. The problem in Kenya is that it's become, politicians have sort of militarised those divisions and armed militia groups and have encouraged violence, and it sort of sets off waves. And I think the ethnicity is often, it's often just understood in terms of identity politics. And it's actually far more complicated than that in Kenya, certainly, in that it's actually a way of talking about history, it's about talking about politics. To go back to that issue about devolution, we were talking about Kalenjin and Kikuyu, very different views of this. So it's very easy to see a Kikuyu and Kalenjin politician in opposition together in something like Nakuru, and seeing that purely as identity politics. But what it actually hides, those labels hide, is a very, very deep-rooted and very reasoned political debate that's taken place. It's perfectly reasonable for Kikuyu, who are spread around the country, to think that central government is a better guarantor of their personal safety and their future than local administrations that might fall into the hands of rival groups. And it's perfectly reasonable for Kalenjin politicians to argue that central government has been exploiting local areas for their own purposes, and it's better for local administrations to be empowered. So there is actually, beneath these labels, actually very, very substantial political debates that go on about issues, and it's just that it tends to get lost. It's in a different sort of language almost than it takes place in other countries. So there are issues in Kenyan politics, and these are important, but they do tend to be ethnically determined. I don't actually see ethnicity as necessarily being a bad thing. There are other. You cannot create nations where nations don't want to be created. Nations historically have required strong states. Kenya doesn't.
And time.
Yeah, and time. Lots
they
of time.
built over time.
Yeah, and Kenya, whatever else it has, doesn't have a particularly strong state. And I don't think it's going to create a nation now. So there have to be other ways forward. The sort of mechanisms that were being discussed earlier in processes about peace building and so on, and reconciliation, justice, to go back to a previous question as well. These are substantial issues that are actually practical, that require policies, reforms, whatever it is. Creating a Kenyan nationality is not, I don't think, a particularly helpful way forward.
If I could add what David has said, it's one of the candidates who performed so badly is of mixed race. His father, I think, is English. His mother is from central Kenya.
Is this Peter Kenneth?
Peter Kenneth. Peter Kenneth was the king of Twitter and Facebook, and he's very charismatic, and he's very, good looking. He looked honest. His constituents for the last 2 years has been voted the best in terms of management of resources. Money you get from central government to run your constituents, he has always done great things with it, and he always accounts for the last cent. And he's well educated. He's a lawyer, and he worked in banks. He has no corruption scandals with him. And then, come election day, until the election, opinion polls used to rank him, he will get between 5 and 6% of the vote. And you looked at how people outvoted him, and it was basically, they say, look, we don't care whether Peter Kenneth's dad is from England, his mother is from Central Region. So he literally got obliterated by the people in Central Province who thought, if we vote for Peter Kenneth, we are reducing the margins for Kenyatta. And the other people outside Central Province, they say, look, this guy and Kenyatta are one and the same. So,
and he was also, didn't people feel that he was a spoiler, sort of?
Yeah, people actually, they used to call him, actually, he's a project by Odinga to come and reduce Kenyatta's margins in Central Province. And Kenneth all along had been campaigning of, look, we don't want political dynasties in this country. Kenya is not a monarch. We want anybody who has, the skills to lead this country, anybody who has, who is honest, or anybody who wants to develop this country to be given an opportunity to do that. So for him, he's one of the people, I think, he has taken back this politics, and possibly he'll say, look, I should just go back to banking and just forget about politics, because it has been a shock for him. Okay. And he was the first person to concede, I've lost it, but I think he's doing serious reflection, and I just felt so sad for him, because I thought, he was somebody who had just risen beyond some of the parochial politicking which was going on around that time.
Can I just see how many more people would like to ask questions? 1, 2, 3. I think let's make those our last questions. That's okay. There's a gentleman just here.
Thank you very much. My name's Abdi Mohidi, I work in the NHS, but I have family and friends in Kenya. It's very depressing what we're talking about today. Some of the things I'm hearing about, the politicians may not have changed their spots, there's violence to come. But actually, when I speak to my family and friends, they're far more enthused, energized, and hopeful for Kenya than they've been in many, many decades. So my question to the panel is, are we really looking at too many dark clouds are there lots of hopeful things, including perhaps a political consensus that traverses ethnicity and one that we can look forward to in a hopeful way?
That sounds almost like a very good way to end the session. So can we hold that in abeyance? And just the other lady over there.
Misha Zganit-Roger, I'm from Chatham House. Well, you mentioned Sky before, but I'd really like to know whether you think that Kenyatta would be able to run the country while attending his trial in The Hague, because clearly he will have to move to The Hague. Even though he's not taken into the ICC's custody, he would have to attend a trial on a daily basis. And we know that the trials at the international courts, including the ICC, might take a couple of years.
I'll answer that very briefly, because his lawyers are investigating the possibility of him actually doing it by a video link. So I suspect we'll have to...
And the case is now back in the pre-trial...
chamber.
Yeah.
So, well, we'll wait and see. What was the last... somebody else had their hand up. Over there?
Oh, hi. My name's Kieran. I work for Radar, which is an organisation that worked with citizen journalists and reporters using social media sites. I'm just wondering what your opinion is on the expansion of platforms like Twitter, and whether you think that had any impact in promoting a peaceful atmosphere this time around.
We addressed that earlier, didn't we?
Yeah, just let me make one comment.
Yeah.
Kenya, I think it ranks to South Africa in terms of Twitter users and the use of Facebook. And Twitter, a lot of people, if you look at the traffic, what stuff people are talking about, most times actually it's not even a source of news. For them it's more of entertainment, and they just pass gossip along. But when they start talking politics, it is a very polarizing thing. And actually today, I think I saw somebody, I don't know what government institution was saying. 1 week after the election, what is being spoken on Twitter and Facebook is very frightening. So social media are very popular a very social platform for people to exchange ideas. It tends to be misused a lot, especially when it comes to politics, because basically you see people there carrying out a lot of ethnic stereotyping, abusing one another on a regional and political ground. So it's great, because it's a great way of passing message. But it's, all the government institutions have been saying our problems are not with the vernacular radio, are not with the mainstream media. It is with social media.
But in 2007, though, it was also a very vigilant form of. It was one of the checks, wasn't it?
It was actually beginning. It was beginning. Yeah. It began as it was text message.
Yeah.
So that was the 5 years ago. Twitter and Facebook were almost non-existent in Kenya. It was text messages. That's what was was the in thing. Now, text message is basically almost dead.
Okay.
Hi, sorry again, Priyachana. Just to address the question raised by the Radar lady. We ran our campaign initially primarily on social media, and we didn't have any above-the-line advertising because all the budget went into securitizing the venue, ensuring that all risk assessments and mitigations were taken care of. We found that the average Kenyan still, at the local level, still relies heavily on SMS platforms versus the social media. Mm-hmm. Social media is targeted primarily at the BU2 and up. And you find that within the voting electorate, Kenya is still a very dynastic situation, not because of the politics, but because of the economics of the situation. The largest landowners, the Kenyatta family, do employ a great deal of Kenyans through their direct businesses and affiliated businesses. I mean, Central Town, CBD in Kenya, half the parking lots are owned by various politicians that haven't been come into question. So I've completely lost my question.
Okay, we'll leave it there then. Now for the final one that the gentleman raised there, that people are much more hopeful and much more enthused.
Economically, Kenya in the last 10 years has changed in a very big way in terms of just the business opportunities have come for the business people, and the liberalization which the government has extended across the economic spectrum. Lots and lots of people see opportunities in which they can do things for themselves, and the other and that gives them hope whereby I can set up a small business here. I don't have to rely on political patronage, and I can do something for myself. That gives people hope. They also look at across state institutions whether there's some substance in it. They see bodies being created to deal with corruption, to do with X, Y, Z, national cohesion. There's that issue. It is just now when, at critical moments of the country's history, when we reach that, that's where it starts getting wrong. You have the 5 years between now and the next election, you are basically ordinary Kenyans get along. They'll do great things themselves, personal development. They'll work across the political divide. But when the key moment to make the political decisions for that country, everybody suddenly just resorts into another mind frame, and that's where at times they can get it wrong. Okay. So, but there's sense for optimism.
Daniel, final remarks.
I meant what I said at the beginning. I don't think we should veer from one extreme to the other, and I agree with everything that's been said there. Culturally as well, Nairobi is just a different place to what it was a decade ago. Yeah. Socially, it's a place of great energy, and not just Nairobi, but small provincial towns that used to be real quiet backwaters are just being completely transformed. And I agree with all those points. We've got to be vigilant. I mean, this was the problem last time, was that one election and one referendum convinced so many people that somehow Kenya's historic ills had been solved, and they hadn't been. And it's, I don't see the role of the media, I don't see myself as an academic to be a cheerleader. That's not what we're here for. And whoever had won the election, I don't think much, to take a very cynical line, much would have changed at all. I think the entrenched interests in Kenyan society are too strong to really change things, and the fundamental problem underlying so much of politics in the country, which we haven't even discussed at all, is inequality. Yes. And that actually worsens at times of economic growth. So,
I'd have to cherry pick from both statements, but I think it's the level of innovation that you see within the economy, things like M-Pesa taking off and becoming a multiplier effect for other small businesses to grow in the most rural areas, increasing the banked population, and internet penetration that increases information flows. And so you start to see this dynamism and synergy with Kenya coming from the bottom up. I think another exciting thing is how incredibly young the population is. If you look at the people who are voting, it was an incredible number of first-time voters going to the polls, and the fact that it was peaceful could be an indication that they are not going to be willing to be used as militants. Yeah. In terms of contesting the power violently. I think another thing is the increasing accountability, and that speaks to the institutions that were entrenched with the new constitution, and the sense that you start to see members of parliament civil society groups starting to hold various institutions within government to account. And you're seeing that more often, and so it shows that the public is very much politically engaged in exercising their democratic rights. And for these reasons, you can see the green shoots that you were asking about. But it would come back to natural resource management, and that hits on the issue of inequality, whether you're talking about the current resources that are developed, such as the land, or the resources to come, like energy sector and the mineral wealth. These are likely to these can either be huge spoilers that bring the country back, or it could be things that could be used to foster economic development while being conscious of issues like Dutch disease. So there are a number of obstacles ahead for Kenya, and while we're optimistic about some indications that you're seeing, there are a number of things that could set the country back.
Well, one of the things that we had a columnist on the program that I work for saying that if you went to sleep 50 years ago and woke up last Monday, you'd think nothing's changed.
Absolutely.
There's a Kenyatta fighting an Odinga. Daniel Arap Moi's two sons are in parliament. So
then the coastal region is seceding. That's what it was in the 60s.
The coastal region is seceding. Yeah, so the more things change, the more things look like they're staying the same in Kenya, certainly. Our panel, thank you very much for coming out on this. And to our audience, thank you very much for coming out on this. we salute you.